everyone. Today we are going to go over creating a thesis statement. So, what is a thesis statement? What are its goals? Well, the kind of thesis statement you write depends on what kind of paper you're writing. So, it just really depends on what exactly you're trying to prove in your paper. But overall, your thesis is just the main point of your paper. So, the biggest thing that you're trying to say is what your thesis is. So basically, in some papers, it's what you're arguing. It's what the paper's just about. And sometimes it's even why it matters. So any one of those could be what your thesis is talking about. So there's different kinds of theses. So for a research paper that like you usually do in a research like science class or a nursing class, you'll likely be writing to be informative. So you'll have done research or something, or you'll have conducted an experiment, and this is you relating your findings or showing and informing someone. So in that case, your thesis will make a claim that's based on your research interpretation, a hypothesis, data, something along that lines. And then it will be supported by the evidence that you've gotten from your sources. So peer-reviewed sources, articles, your research, studies, things of those nature. On the other hand, you also have like a textual analysis thesis. And this happens in classes like Western Heritage, any English literature class. In those, what you'll be writing is an argumentative thesis. So where the other one is meant to relay information, this one is meant to present some sort of argument or analysis. So in this one, you would make a claim, which could be an opinion, an evaluation, an interpretation, analysis, something along those lines. And then you would support it with evidence from the text. So the main difference here is one of them is relying on a very strict, so textual analysis relies on a very strict, I'm using this book, I'm pulling quotes from here, I'm analyzing what these quotes are saying. Whereas for a research paper in general, you could be drawing from a number of sources, and your aim could be more to be informative than to be making an argument per se or an analysis. So how do you create a thesis statement? So there's really two big issues that come up when it comes to creating your thesis statement. The first one is just coming up with the idea, and the second part follows that, and that's putting that idea into words. And sometimes even just calling it a thesis statement can make it seem like a very daunting task. Saying that I've got to get my thesis statement down can be really nerve-wracking for some people. But the important thing to remember is you're just asking yourself, what do I want someone to know after reading my paper? So essentially, what is the main point of my paper? That's what your thesis is. And a really important thing also to remember is that it's not permanent. Many people will write a thesis at the beginning of the writing process and have to go back and revise it at the end. So, sometimes what you think you're going to be proving isn't necessarily what you end up proving. So it's always important to remember that even though you've put it down, it's not set in stone, and you can always go back and adjust it if needed. Another really important thing about a thesis statement is to avoid beginning it with I think or I believe. In those cases, say if your example was about the Tempest and you were making an argument about Prospero, saying I think Prospero, and then the rest of your statement is much less definitive than just saying Prospero is. It really adds more of the definitive aspect to your statement. And in most formal papers as well, first person like I, you, we, our isn't used. So getting out of that habit of saying I think or I believe really helps to keep your formal writing in the right format and things of that. It's not bad to say like I think when you're trying to articulate it to yourself, though. That can be a good way to start thinking out what you want to say. But when you write down your actual thesis statement, you just remove that piece. A good thing to take a look at is this checklist. So this checklist can be really helpful when it comes to making sure you've got all the right things. So these are just a few questions. I'm sure if you searched online, you'd be able to find other kinds of checklists for your thesis statement. But these are the really key ones that we at the Writing Center really focus on. So first and foremost, is it specific? So you don't want to be doing too broad of a thesis statement. because there's only so much you can prove in a paper. You know, if it's too broad, if it's too general, then you're not making the right claim, and usually it makes it really hard for you to write the paper. The next step is argumentative. So in a thesis statement, there has to be something that you are making a claim on that someone could claim the opposite. So there has to be some kind of arguable, or argumentative aspect to it. So if I said, I think Prospero is evil, obviously somebody else could say, I think Prospero is good. So having that, there should be another side to it. And if what you've stated doesn't have an argumentative aspect, it can be pretty easy to find a way to make it argumentative, but that is something you really want to keep an eye on. Third is is it a roadmap for the rest of the essay? So in this instance, what we mean is someone should be able to read your thesis and not only have a clear idea of what the main point of your paper is, but they should also be able to see kind of where you're going to go with it. And we'll get into an example of this on the next slide, but that's just a general. Having a roadmap in your thesis really makes it easy for people to read your paper. And then the last two are more logistical. So does it answer the prompt? You really want to make sure you're addressing whatever it is your professor is looking for, whatever it is this prompt is asking of you. So it's really good sometimes to read the prompt and then read your thesis. And if there's some part of the prompt that your thesis hasn't addressed, or your thesis doesn't quite make sense as an answer to the prompt, that can be a good way to recognize if you're on the right track. And then the last one is really just logistical. Does it come at the end of the introduction? Theses are always found at the end of the introduction paragraph. It's the very last sentence, or in some cases could be a couple sentences. But as long as it's always there, it just makes it easy for people to find. And it's just a really common use of this as well. Okay, so on this slide, so we're going to take a look at some thesis statements. So on here it says we're going to move from simple to complex, but I kind of call it definite, tentative to definite. So here's an example of what someone might write at the beginning of their writing process as a tentative thesis. So it says the North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons, some of which were the same and some different. So in this case, you can kind of see that the main idea is there. It's, they're talking about the Civil War, but it's general. There isn't any specificity in, what are the reasons, and what some were different and some were the same, but it's still very broad. But it does have a main point. It is arguable, as somebody could say, no, I think they only fought for one reason, and they were all the same. So there is some argumentative of it. And so but it doesn't offer much of a roadmap. So looking at this, I don't really know where the paper's going to go based off of this thesis. But as you go, so that might be something someone would write at the beginning, just to get their thoughts down and get kind of an idea of what they're trying to say. This might be something when you're in the middle of the writing process. This is something you've started to get your ideas down, and you're starting to get a better idea of what you're trying to say. And so this might be a revised thesis. So this one says, while both sides fought the Civil War over the issue of slavery, the North fought for moral reasons, while the South fought to preserve its own institutions. So already this is more specific. You get a clearer idea of what exactly the paper's trying to say. But it's still a bit general. I mean, there's some vagaries around own institutions, and it's not a super clear roadmap. So we're not really sure. So maybe it will talk about the issue of slavery, maybe moral reasons, but it's not it's not very definitive. And this last example is one that would probably be like a finalized thesis. So after the whole process is done, the writer goes back and decides that they're going to finalize their thesis, make sure it addresses everything they bring up in their paper. And so that's what this final one might look like. So right here it says, while both Northerners and Southerners believed they fought against tyranny and oppression, Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their own right to self-government. So in this instance, it's very specific. It's very clear about both of them believing in their cause. They focused on the oppression of slavery. South was looking for the right to self-government. So it's very specific in what they were looking for. It's a very clear roadmap. I know that they're going to talk about how they both believed in something, and then the focus on the Northerners looking at slavery, Southerners looking at government. So it's a very clear roadmap. This seems like it's still answering the same question. So as you can see, the prompt is still being answered through all of them. And it's a very clear progression. But that's just kind of an example of how you don't always have to have exactly what you're going to have your thesis look like in the very beginning. Or, I mean, as either, that might not be a beginning one, that might just be one that's just a starting point. All right, so here we're going to take a moment to practice. So in the following slide, there's going to be a prompt, and your task is to come up with a thesis statement that you could use in a potential paper in response to the prompt. And you want to keep the things you've been talking about in mind. Is it specific? Does it answer the prompt? Is it argumentative? All of those things when you make it. So here is the prompt, and you can go ahead and pause the video if you want to go ahead and do that task. But looking at the thesis statement you've just created, let's take a look at how you did. So first and foremost, did you avoid starting with I think or I believe? Is it specific? Could somebody argue against it? Does it indicate where the rest of the paper will go? Does it have that roadmap? And does it answer the original question? So is it addressing the prompt? Remember, you can always go back and adjust it if need be. So if there's a part that your thesis statement right now is not fulfilling within this criteria, you can always go back and fix it. But yeah, so if there's any final questions, if you have any questions after watching this video, please feel free to email the Writing Center. It's writingcenter@carthage.edu. We'll be happy to get back to you. Or if we're back in school, you can definitely come by the center and ask one of our fellows in person. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.